General Arnold was sent with a force to help relieve Fort Stanwix, and they played a real trick on the Indians by getting the word to them in a way, in a manner that they would believe that the American force coming at them was much bigger than the actual force was.
You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are very fortunate to have William L. Kidder, retired history teacher, author, public speaker, and historian extraordinaire. So welcome, William.
You can call me Larry.
Well, welcome, Larry. Larry, we're talking about your book, Defending Fort Stanwix, the story of the New York frontier and the American Revolution. Tell us a little bit about yourself and where we can find your book.
Well, I'm a retired history teacher, a high school history teacher, and I've been involved with local historical sites and societies and things like that around New Jersey for a long, long time now. And I have written several books on the Trenton area and the middle, today's Mercer County in New Jersey, where the 10 Crucial Days and battles of Trenton and Princeton, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm also interested in the wider revolution and got involved with this book primarily because I have an ancestor who was in the garrison at Fort Stanwix during the siege. He was part of the 3rd New York Continental Regiment. And so I've always been interested in what he experienced. And in fact, for me, history is what people experience. It's not just a bunch of dates and things like that. It's human experiences. I often told my kids when I was teaching that they were studying history, not so much to be able to plug in dates and names on a test, but to learn what it is to be a human being and learn what human beings have experienced throughout thousands of years. And so that they know that difficulties that they have in life or decisions they have to make is not new. They're repeating history in many ways, at least the circumstances, if not the actual events themselves. And so history is learning what it is to be a human being. And so I wanted to get that into the story of Fort Stanwix to understand some more about my background.
Well, any book that you write is a monumental task. The book that you've written here obviously is a monumental task. Tell me about your preparation for the book and how you did the research on it.
Okay, yeah. Well, I've been working on it a long time. This was actually going to be the first book that I did when I retired, and it's about number 9 on the list. So I've done research in a lot of different places. I've been to the fort itself, the national park, reconstruction of the fort. I've traveled in the Mohawk Valley area where it is. And I've also done a ton of research at a facility that no longer exists, the David Library of the American Revolution, which now has its collection at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, but it used to be a separate location about 20 minutes from my home. So I practically lived there. They had all kinds of stuff from, international as well as American. It was definitely a primary area to do research. But I've also gone to Albany and other places in New York and done research. And one of the really cool things about living as long as I have is the internet. And so many things being digitized now and being made available on the internet that didn't used to be. And so that helps historians not quite travel as much as they once did. And one of the primary things on the internet is pension applications from veterans of the Revolution. And they were a treasure trove of information to go through and find out about individual people, individual men and women who were at the fort during and before and after the siege. It was just very illuminating to do that. And also a number of war records, unit records, regimental records, muster rolls, things like that, orderly books, all kinds of things are online now. And that's been a big help.
Right, right. So, how would you classify this book?
Well, it's definitely nonfiction. It's definitely a history book. I hope that it more or less reads like a novel, in many, at least in some sections. But nothing. I haven't added anything to it to enliven the story or anything like that. I've simply used the good stuff that I found.
What I have found is a lot of these places that we take for granted, the historical record actually shows in many cases that these names change over the. What are some of the other names it had?
Well, it really had one other name, and that was Fort Schuyler, and that was during the Revolution, the period that I'm looking at. It was originally Fort Stanwix. It was named after a British general during the French and Indian War, the general who was assigned to have the fort built. That was its official name. Then it was changed by one of the American Revolution forces that occupied it, and it was named after the Schuyler family of Albany, and particularly Philip Schuyler, who was a big officer in the Continental Army. So it was named for him. An issue there was that a lot of people in the area didn't really like the Schuylers. They were landowners, they were the royalty, if you will, of that area. And because it had been known as Fort Stanwix for so long, people just wanted to keep calling it that. So I had to be aware that in official records during most of the Revolution, it was Fort Schuyler, and in ordinary people or in lower ranking people, it was often Fort Stanwix. They finally gave up on the Fort Schuyler by the end of the war, and they went back to calling it Fort Stanwix.
So where was it located in relation to
Albany? Okay. Well, think of New York State and think of the Mohawk River running right through the middle, east to west, at least halfway across from east to west. And then where the Mohawk really begins and then flows towards the Hudson, if there was a portion of land, and then there was rivers on the other way that flowed into Lake Ontario. So there was a water route right across the middle of New York State, and Fort Stanwix was basically right in the middle of that main transportation route on a piece of land that became known as the Carry Place, because if you were coming from the Hudson River up the river, you had to carry your boat and everything, the Mohawk River to Woods Creek, and then put the boat back in the water and then go all the way to the west. And if you're traveling the other way, it was just the opposite. So it was a portage place right in the middle of that very important transportation and communication route. Today it's Rome, New York.
So at that time, Native Americans that occupied that area or were around that area, who were they?
Well, in that whole area of New York were the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee, as they prefer to be known. At various times, 5 tribes, 6 tribes, a confederation and that sort of thing. And so they spread from the Hudson River to the west, all across this transportation route that we're talking about. So you had the Mohawks, which were closest to the Hudson River, and the Senecas, which were out in the west. And then kind of right in the middle where Fort Stanwix was, that was territory occupied by the Oneida Nation. And that made things interesting in many ways, because in the French and Indian War, the Native Americans had to decide which side they were going to support or whatever. And then certainly it came up again in the Revolution. And the Oneida, those Indians that were around Fort Stanwix, definitely sided with the Americans, with the Patriots. And most of the other Iroquois nations sided with the British. So there was a civil war going on between the Iroquois themselves at the time. And there was also a civil war going on between the settlers in the area, those who supported the British and those who supported the Patriots. So it made for a very, very interesting but complex relationship between people.
We take for granted a lot of the things that happened in the Revolutionary War, but certainly in the backcountry of New York, things were were kind of in doubt there for a while. The British were trying to push into that area and lay claim to that area, or stay as the main hegemon. And how far was Fort Ticonderoga from there?
Fort Ticonderoga, as the crow flies, was about 110 miles. But basically, to get there, you had to go. That was like the hypotenuse of a triangle. You had to go the two legs of the triangle to really get there. So be much more distant than that.
Did the Native Americans want Fort Stanwix around? I know we talked about. You said the Civil War between the Native Americans, and did they like Fort Stanwix? Or I would imagine that there was some conflict there, where they felt like, okay, they promised us they wouldn't push any further into the backcountry, but yet they continue with this fort. Was there a conflict over that?
Well, yes. But there were times when and conditions under which they wanted the fort there. Just to back up a little bit, the Proclamation of 1763, which theoretically was a boundary that the British would not go west of and take more native land. That started just about where Fort Stanwix was. In fact, there was another treaty, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, that redefined the proclamation line, and it put Fort Stanwix right at the end of the area that the British could have settlement. So theoretically, it wasn't supposed to go beyond that. But it's right in the middle of the Iroquois nations, confederation. And it's because it's right on the communication line. It was a trade route that went way back, the fur trade and that kind of thing, back with the Dutch and the British very early in the colonial period. The area was very important. So you had a lot of travel through that area. The Iroquois, particularly the Oneida, they looked at Fort Stanwix as a potential trading post, a trading area that would help enrich them, in their trading occupation. They didn't like the fact that there were going to be soldiers there, that would be controlling them in some ways and perhaps drawing activity, military activity to their area. So there was a constant back and forth between how much is this going to be a military thing, how much is this going to be a trade area that will build things up rather than tear things down. And that became a major issue. During the French and Indian War, when Fort Stanwix was built, there was the promise that it would be taken down after the war. There was not a permanent military thing to keep the Native Americans under control or anything like that. That didn't really happen. The fort was abandoned and it kind of fell apart, but it was still there and still known. And when the Americans decided in the early Revolution to rebuild it and re-garrison it, they had to have some conversations with the Oneida about that. And the Oneida were fine, focusing on, make it a trading post, make it a trading post. And they were not as happy about soldiers going there, but they allowed it. And they were definitely on our side. I mean, they helped out at the siege to defend the fort. So it wasn't that they were that angry about it.
Well, tell me about the siege. Tell me how that went down. There was a number of years where nothing was happening. There were rumors that things were going to happen, but nothing really happened. And I would think that the garrison life was a tedious life, and there was all sorts of problems maintaining a force there that was controllable. Tell us a little bit about the siege, when that happened, and how that took place.
Okay. Well, let me just say that the book deals with the siege, but the siege was only about 3 weeks, about 21, 22 days. But the story that I tell is more like a year and a half. The 3rd New York Continental Regiment, that is the primary topic or the primary garrison of the period that I cover, was there that whole time period. So for 21 days, they were besieged. But for the entire year and a half that they were there, the soldiers had to be really careful about leaving the fort and going any distance from it without a group of people, without guards, without scouts, things like that, in order not to be attacked. life was very dangerous out there because, again, even if there wasn't a British army besieging the fort, there were Native Americans who were sided with the British, who were in the area and making life miserable for anybody who supported the Patriot cause because they were supporting the British. The story, there were some civilians living around the fort as well as the fort garrison, and they ran into situations where, the Oneidas might be friendly to them, but the Mohawks or the Senecas or others were not. So it was really tense day in and day out, even if there wasn't the actual siege going on. When the siege finally came in August of 1777, it was a different kind of siege than you might picture. Normally, you would picture the attacking army, in this case, the British, bringing a lot of artillery and pounding the fort into submission. I mean, no infantryman wants to run at a fort where all the defenders are behind the walls and they're out in the open shooting at them. They want to break things up, before they actually take on the fort itself and the garrison inside. And that's actually not going to happen during the siege, because Colonel St. Ledger made a huge mistake. He only brought a small number of small caliber artillery. He did not bring the big stuff. And he believed that that was okay because everything that he had heard about the fort was that it was in ruins and that there weren't that many people at it, at the garrison. So once he started the siege, he kind of started realizing, wait a minute, this isn't going to work. But he had to keep at it. He had to try to make it work. Just to back up, the Americans had rebuilt the fort, not completely. I think the story of Fort Stanwix is interesting. It was never complete. Okay, people were always complaining, I got this much to do, I got that much to do, we're getting close, but we don't have it all set. I think it was very appropriate that when the National Park Service rebuilt the fort, rebuilt a model of it, right on the footprint where it had been, that when it came time for the opening weekend of it, the fort wasn't quite done yet. And I think that was very appropriate to the fort's history. Okay. The siege was basically British artillery, small guns firing at the fort, snipers in trees not too far from the fort, often Native Americans. The British force was partly British regulars, partly Native Americans from several different tribes, and also loyalists. There was quite a large loyalist force. And one thing that people don't really understand is the besiegers, the loyalists, were basically friends and relatives of the people at the fort because they had been kicked out of the area by the Patriots and gone to Canada or whatever and set up loyalist units that were going to fight alongside the British. So, it really was a civil war in that respect. A number of the men in the 3rd New York Regiment were also from the Mohawk Valley area. And so it's a local fight as much as it is an international fight. The siege itself, like I say, was very frustrating for both sides. The Americans couldn't get rid of the British, and the British couldn't defeat the Americans. And so they're just kind of going at it. And then finally the British leave. And the British leave after the Battle of Oriskany. I think it's important to recognize the Battle of Oriskany as part of I won't say part of the siege, but part of the activity in the Mohawk Valley that affected the siege. It took place while the siege was going on. It took place because some local Patriot militia were going to go help the fort and help the garrison, and the British counteracted that, primarily with loyalists, again, who are fighting their family and friends there, as well as Native Americans who were fighting among the nations of the Iroquois there. But that battle did not end the siege by any means. It was quite early in the process. But then to get the British to actually leave, it was a combination of things. Number one, it was taking weeks, not days. And Native Americans at that time, they believed in living to fight another day. They weren't into mass casualties for a number of reasons. one of which was there just weren't that many of them. The Native Americans have been wiped out by disease and all kind of things, for hundreds of years at this point. The Iroquois tribes were trying to increase their numbers, partly through warfare and taking captives, and then adopting the captives into their local tribe and capturing colonists and turning them into members of their tribe. So even the Oneida Nation was not pure blood Oneida. Okay, they had a lot of DNA that had come into the nation. But anyway, the nations were small, and they didn't want to kill everybody off in a big battle. People that were with St. Ledger, fighting with him, wanted to get the heck out of there because they were just taking casualties and not really accomplishing anything. And so finally, a relief force from General Burgoyne's army, which was coming down south, through the Lake Champlain area towards Albany. It's going to end up at the Battle of Saratoga, if you're familiar with that. St. Ledger was supposed to be going there to join up with him, and troops were supposed to be coming up from New York to join together. So it was going to be a three-force joining there, and hopefully split New York off from split the northern colonies off from the southern colonies. So there were a lot of American troops that were forming there, and General Arnold was sent with a force to help relieve Fort Stanwix, and they played a real trick on the Indians by getting the word to them in a manner that they would believe that the American force coming at them was much bigger than the actual force was, and that they were pretty much doomed. So St. Ledger's Indians basically left them, partly because of that, and partly because they were ready to go anyway, because they were tired of fighting and dying and nothing being accomplished. So St. Ledger then had to take his troops also and retreat out. But it wasn't really a battle. It was the fear of a battle that got St. Ledger and his Indian allies to leave. That, of course, is going to be important to the Battle of Saratoga because a portion of the group that was supposed to meet around Albany didn't get there, and the New York group never came up. So it was just Burgoyne, and obviously he lost, and that was a major, if not the major, turning point of the revolution.
It's a great book, especially if you're someone who wants to know how the everyday soldier kind of dealt with some of the grind of the Revolutionary War. I mean, garrison duty is not for the faint of heart. I mean, it's long, arduous days, and they were rebuilding that fort all through that process. And they had some people that were overseeing it that didn't know what they were doing in many cases, right? So,
exactly.
And it wasn't speculation on your part. What you're putting into this book is all research. You're getting some of it even from the letters that these people have written back and forth. It was very good to see that, very good to see your research. And I really appreciated the detail that you had in it. I liked the fact that, you had snipers taking out the sentinels on the walls of the fort. It was like a Indian sniper, and they finally figured out where he was, and they took the cannon and aimed it at him, blew him out of the tree. The story is great for the historian. In me, I enjoyed reading it. What would you want people to take away from their time or take away from this book?
Well, I definitely would like people to take away some of the things you're just kind of alluding to there, that history is human, and history has a lot of human stories in it. And as I was saying earlier, how people deal with different things that come into their life, including boredom and day-to-day being so much the same. And I'm so restricted in what I can do because of the situation, but then find ways for life to go on. I mean, I also would like people to know that in the Continental Army, the Army was somewhat like a community. It wasn't just a bunch of guys off, by themselves doing military stuff. I mean, some of them had their wives at the fort. A baby was born to one of the soldier families during the siege. The mother had taken a wound to her derriere the night before and then gave birth the following morning. And both mother and daughter did fine. My ancestor, whose name was Peter Scriber, actually got a leave of absence from the fort, got a furlough. I guess it was about 2 weeks after the siege, and was able to go back home. He lived in Rhinebeck, New York, on the Hudson River, and he got married during that furlough. And I can only assume that his wife came back and was at the fort. I wish I could prove she was a camp follower, because he stayed in the Army for the rest of the war. He was in for 6.5 years, and the siege was early in his career. But during the war, they had 2 babies born while he was off on duty. And one of those is my ancestor. So I like to think that in the story with Fort Stanwix includes both my male ancestor plus his wife plus their child, although the child was born long after the siege. I just see it as so human, and I want people to understand the Continental Army that way. I also want them to understand the Continental Army was constantly going through change, and I think that comes out in the book also.
Where would they find your book?
Well, it's being published by Cornell University Press under their Three Hills imprint. Certainly it's available from them. I'm assuming that it's going to be, I know they do good marketing, so I assume it will be available in bookstores and online. A bookstore that I would really recommend is the Fort Plain Museum bookstore. Fort Plain is another fort in the Mohawk River Valley, and it's a fabulous place that helps the history of that area and helps the history of the Revolution in general. And they have so many good books that they sell. And that helps to support the development of history in the Mohawk Valley. So the proceeds from the book go to a good cause there.
Outstanding. What does liberty, this is something I try to ask all my guests, what does liberty mean to you?
Well, liberty is a really interesting thing. For me, there's not one way to look at liberty. There are many, many ways to look at liberty. I'm a U.S. Navy veteran. I looked at liberty as a way to get away from work, okay, to get off base or to get off the ship and that kind of thing. And be free to do what I wanted to do and not be under orders all the time. But that's very different. There's also, we look at liberty in a political sense as freedom to make various decisions that we want to, things that we want to do rather than things that we are ordered to do. And I think that freedom is one of those words that has a lot of scope to it. It's not just one thing or another. It varies all the time. And you have to look at liberty and actually freedom, the same thing, in relationship to a situation rather than just a global understanding. In any situation the word is used, it's got some subtle as well as outward meanings and variation in meaning.
I'm very excited that I was able to read this book, and I hope our listeners are too. So thank you so much.